Okay, my article was over William Faulkner's Light in August, and the critical article itself is entitled Rope and Faggot, the Homoerotics of Lynching in William Faulkner's Light in August, and it was by Nathan Tipton. You probably won't be able to read this from the video, but hopefully Dr. Chappell is able to let you guys preview my slideshow somehow. I'm gonna send it to her. So in the novel, Nathan Tipton argues that lynching is derivative from the South's mentality of queerness being this abomination type thing, and in a big way, interracial and same-sex relationships are seen as abominable and wrong, and so the lynching itself is this act of sexual aggression. So a quote from my article stated, "The overemphasis on sex in the lynching states has made the South the terrified victim of its own sexual fears." So basically what Nathan Tipton is saying is that because people in the South viewed homosexuality in this really bad light, in this bad way, lynching was a way for males to, for the first time, to kind of play on their sexual desires onto other men. So the torture, which is an accompaniment of modern lynching, shows that it is an act of perversion only found in those suffering from extreme forms of sexual perversion. Of course, not all lynchings are conducted in this fashion, but it is not uncommon to read accounts telling that the victim was tortured with hot irons, that his eyes were burned out, and that other monstrous cruelties were inflicted upon him. Such bestiality can be recognized only as a form of perversion. So there's that restatement and reiteration of perversion. So the author of this article really is viewing lynching as a sexual action. So the title, Rope and Faggot, the rope, the literal meaning of that is just referring to the method that they strung up the victims. And faggot is emblematic of the fire that culminated in a successful lynching, or obviously it's a slang used to describe a homosexual man. So that multiple meaning there just has a lot of implicatory meaning for the article itself. So again, the act of lynching is sexualized in this article. Lynching was a community event that always included a violent sexual element, and lynching was a releaser of sexual anxiety between the races because it was the only stage on which it was acceptable for the white man to take pleasure in the sexual manipulation of the black man. So, lynching associates torture with sexual dysfunction, and it combines that with a sexual anxiety between the races. There was an anxiety because they were not ever able to act on their desires and impulses. Lynching blacks became a way to reinforce and defend normative Southern identity. So even though I think the South was like 2/3 black, putting blacks in that position of inferiority was a way to keep them in that societal stratification, because in a big way blackness was a sexual threat, and so it's not okay for black people to mix that. Oh gosh, I'm thinking of a word. The miscegenation kind of transcends over to that line of including sexuality. So it's the miscegenation even in sexuality combined with homosexuality. So there's just that homosexual panic, and this gave those men an opportunity to act on that. So in the article, Tipton goes over Eve Sedgwick's analysis of male friendship and the definitional crisis surrounding that. It argues that male friendship ultimately traps men in the quicksands of homosexual desire. There's always this inevitable feminine presence in a male-male relationship. So what that means is basically, if you have two men that are in a friendship together, there's always this need for a feminine presence, because if that presence is not there, then it's a homosexual relationship, which was considered wrong. Faulkner, however, Tipton argues, erases the feminine component, and in doing that, endorses the doomed homosexual. So what that means is just that when you erase the need for the feminine presence, ultimately you have a homosexual relationship. In that society, homosexual relationships were not condoned, so they were considered wrong. So Faulkner's taking that out of the typical normative situation, he's basically stating through his literature that, no matter how much you suppress homosexuality, it's always going to coexist with other forms of sexuality, but he is endorsing the homosexual, even if that means, per that time period, that character was going to have a tragic experience or be a tragic character. His homosexuality is still a factor. So in the novel, Percy Grimm, I termed on the slideshow the new man. We talked about in class the new woman, and to me Percy Grimm just seems like the new man. Because just as the new woman, explored her sexuality and was, edgy and that sort of thing, then Percy, through this article, how this article constructs his character, Percy, I just see a lot of those same characteristics lining up with exploring your sexuality and dealing with your sexuality in that time. So at the time Faulkner was writing, the model of inversion was the standard way of naming deviance. In this model, a homosexual male can only be effeminate, yet part of the way that Faulkner's texts refuse to disavow homosexuality is by unhinging the presumed conjunction of heterosexuality and masculinity. In other words, one can be a male and a heterosexual and still not be a man. So basically, Percy Grimm embodies this effeminate male, and the article argues that he's homosexual. It's really an interpretive thing. Personally, I saw this, and this did not come from the article, this was my own thing, but we talked about Bobby and Joanna Burden. Bobby having that smaller complex, like physically, and Burden having that more manly exterior. And to me, Percy was like the manifestation of both of those things conjoined. And interestingly enough, he battles with his desires for Joe Christmas, and Joe Christmas, ironically, has been with both of these women. So I don't know if that really resonates with you, but it did with me. In the article, Tipton talks about the homophonal kinship with gay slang terms such as pansy and pussy that resonate for Percy, the name. So he said that in the time that this was written, saying the word Percy probably would have sounded more like how we would say the word pussy, which is very indicative of Percy's character. So Joe Christmas is the novel's ideal masculine image, whereas Percy Grimm is the feminine castrating presence. And Tipton even argued that, like, since his last name is Grimm, you could even say, like, Grimm Pussy, which literally makes him a castrating character. And so then we're going back to that masculine anxiety, specifically what Percy faces. So Percy faces masculine anxiety, which he displaces by lynching Joe Christmas. His knowledge of Christmas and Brown's relationship angers him because his own sexuality and homosexual desire is suppressed, while Christmas seems to be fucking with everything except him, physically and psychologically. So Percy lynches Joe Christmas very explicitly and very gruesomely, and the idea that Tipton is trying to portray here is that Percy's sexual otherness had to be repressed or suppressed, and Joe Christmas, on the other hand, was not as socially aware and didn't have that same social anxiety that Percy obviously deals with. And Percy ends up taking all of that anger and frustration with the society in which he lives, and he ends up lynching Joe Christmas just tragically, and it represents his homoerotic desire to control and totally possess Joe Christmas. Percy literally makes Joe Christmas a woman by cutting off his penis, specifically. So he makes him a woman, and in that scene, it's very short, it's just a page long, which in which that's dealt with, but he has so desired to be able to be with another man, and so this finally gives him a place in which he can be that. In this moment, he takes on the role of the masculine male in that homosexual relationship. Specifically in Faulkner's Southern Landscape that he writes in, white masculinity is not wholly heterosexual, as we see with Joe Christmas, potentially Brown, and now obviously Percy. So it's therefore prone to the complications stemming from the homosocial, homoerotic, and racial complexities within masculinity construction. So Percy is living out his desire because he's lynching and both possessing a mixed male. Again, Percy Grimm is Faulkner's doomed homosexual. He experiences that jealousy, anger, sexual otherness that does marginalize his character. So ultimately with this article, Tipton argues that Faulkner is saying homosexuality and sexual otherness will perpetually exist because they are real things. And even though Percy is doomed and both Percy and Christmas have these bad endings that we would not consider happy endings, Faulkner kind of allows them to happen because Faulkner was writing to make something known, but at the same time to get through the time period without it being altogether suppressed. So Faulkner's argument through that is sort of like, I'm gonna write about it and talk about it and make it known in the societal context that is appropriate. And for that time, it did involve lynchings and difficult circumstances that characters had to work through. So that is Nathan Tipton's queer take on Faulkner's Light in August.